Howdy, and welcome to Chapter 4. In Chapter 4, we're going to continue with our instructional analysis by identifying subordinate and entry skills. Here's where we are in the Dick and Carey model. So as you remember, we at the first step assessed the needs. We came up with an instructional goal, and then we developed goal steps for that goal, classified the goal, and in this particular phase, we're going to do the sub-skills for the goal steps that we've already developed. So instructional analysis, just to review, is a set of procedures that, when applied to an instructional goal, identifies the relevant steps for performing the goal and the subordinate skills required for the learner to achieve the goal. In Chapter 3, we talked about two parts of the goal analysis. First, we classified the goal. Remember, that's where we said it was classified as verbal, intellectual, attitudinal, or psychomotor. We then identified and sequenced the steps. In Chapter 4, we're going to analyze the sub-skills. We have to identify the sub-skills for each one of the goal steps we identified in the goal analysis. Then we also identify the required entry behavior that learners need before they start training. So what is a subordinate skills analysis? Okay, the purpose is to identify a set of subordinate skills for each step. Okay, that's the main purpose. If required skills are omitted from instruction and many students don't already have them, the instruction would be ineffective. Okay, however, if we include skills in here that really aren't important, then that kind of takes away from the instruction. It causes the instruction to take more time than it should. It also causes interference with how the learners are going to learn. Okay, so the process of examining each individual step of the instructional goal, we focus on the question, what should a person already know or be able to do before they can learn to perform the goal? So we use different analysis techniques with different types of goals. Okay, so we're going to look at how we would approach this if we have an attitudinal goal, a verbal goal, and so forth. So if our goal is intellectual or psychomotor, we're going to use a hierarchical approach. So what this means is that we have to ask ourselves, what must the student already know, so with a minimal amount of instruction this task can be learned. And we keep repeating this question until we're down to very simple basic skills. Here's an example of a hierarchical goal. This happens to be a psychomotor goal, play golf. We've identified 5 goal steps: putting, chipping, hitting irons, hitting woods. So if you look at the first one, putting, we've identified sub-skills for putting. The first is to plan the stroke required to put the ball into the cup. Okay, then we go on to say, after that, we assume a stance based on the plan, grip the club, so on and so forth. So if we look at just the first sub-skill step, plan the stroke required to put the ball into the cup, you can see where the hierarchical analysis comes in. We would start at the bottom with step 1.1a, where it says determine lay of land between ball and cup, tilt and slope, and then we move on to predict exact trajectory and so forth. So you can see where the sub-skills, kind of, you have to start at the bottom, you do that one, then you move up. Okay, so for a verbal goal, we're going to use cluster analysis. Okay, here's an example of cluster analysis. So we group things, like this particular goal was name the parts of the body. Okay, so by doing that, we've clustered the areas Okay, so parts of the head, parts of the arm, parts of the head or hand, and so forth. So we cluster them according to category, and then we break them out with that. So you notice there aren't any arrows here. It's not that these are sequential or we necessarily do one before the other. Attitude goals are kind of weird because they really have two distinct parts. One is the rationale for the learner making a particular choice. We have to get the learner to choose to do something. And then we use a hierarchical analysis, okay, to identify the sub-skills. So here's an example of that. This is a goal about identifying and following emergency and safety procedures while staying in a hotel. It has an A, so we know it's clearly an attitudinal goal because a person has to choose to maximize personal safety. So we've identified 3 goal steps here. The first is to identify and follow safety precautions for hotel fires. Okay, so if we go down, the first sub-skill is at check-in, inquire about hotel safety precautions, rules, and procedures. Okay, and the V connected there, state danger to hotel residents from fire, indicates that this is a verbal goal, and this is what we want the learner to be able to tell us. Okay, and if you look at each step, this whole goal is a verbal attitudinal goal. Okay, so entry behaviors are the skills required of the learner before instruction begins. Okay, and these are identified once the subordinate skills are reduced to basic performance skills. Once we've gone through those levels of what does the learner need to do this, what does the learner need to do this, and we keep going till we get to very general type skills at that point. So we examine the subordinate skills analysis results for the skills that most of our learning population will already have mastered. Okay, then we draw a dotted line above the entry behaviors to indicate them on our diagram. So here's an example of that. This is a goal for recruiters and technical implementation service staff at Crystal Database Applications, demonstrating some various skills. Okay, so it's an attitudinal goal in that we want them to demonstrate behavior necessary to meet department goals and choose to follow behavioral guidelines while at work. So this shows the steps. There are 5 steps to this goal and each of the sub-steps. But notice then there's a dotted line. And below the dotted line, we have our entry skills, entry behaviors. So we expect the learner to come to the training already having these things, already being proficient in computer skills, being able to speak and write fluently in English, being able to read technical instructions, and we want them to have a high level of product knowledge because we aren't going to teach these things in our training. But if someone comes and does not have these things, then our training may become difficult for that person and they may not be able to learn. Okay, so Chapter 5 moves on to analyzing learners in context. So here's where we are in the Dick and Carey diagram. We've moved ahead a step after we conduct our instructional analysis and we know what we want the behaviors to be. Now we need to take a really close look at who are our learners and where will they be performing the behavior I'm teaching them and where will I be teaching them this behavior. We want to analyze those in order to understand how to best do our training. So what do we want to know about learners? We want to know the variables that significantly affect the achievement of the group of learners we will instruct, because designers create instruction for groups of learners having common characteristics. Okay, so we want to identify this set of variables, okay, because it affects their learning. Okay, And we can also modify our instructional strategy based upon these variables in order for our training to be most effective. So who is the target population? What do we mean when we say target population for our training? The target population are just those learners that we want to give the instruction to. They're the target population. So we could identify them as maybe new employees with the company going through onboarding. We could say it's a 5th grade class learning geometry, and so on and so forth. So those are examples of target population, but just think of it as just the group of people that you really are targeting your instruction toward. So what information do we want to know about, the target population? So we'll go through and we'll do an analysis. We'll gather all this information because it helps us develop the instruction. So we want to know entry skills. We need to know if the target population members already mastered the entry skills. Because if they haven't, then I may need to go back and teach those skills or do some kind of remediation. So we need to know where they stand with the entry skills. What's their prior knowledge of the topic area? Okay, what do they already know? What don't they know? Okay, because sometimes a learner could have some kind of knowledge about the area that's incorrect, and we would want to know that going forward. We'd want to know about their attitudes toward the content and potential delivery system. They may have impressions or attitudes about the topic to be taught and how it's going to be delivered. This can affect how they learn and their motivation. Okay, and then academic motivation. We need to know how motivated are these learners to learn what we're trying to teach them. It's very difficult to teach somebody who is not motivated to learn. Okay, and think of yourself in different classes, and sometimes you were really motivated. You may have liked the topic or felt like it was relevant to you and really wanted to learn, versus maybe another class where you really didn't care much about it. Okay, so you learn more when you're motivated. We'd want to know about their educational levels and ability levels, their learning preferences, because we can structure our training toward learning preferences. And lastly, their attitudes toward the organization. How do they feel about the organization? Do they have a positive view? Do they like their managers and supervisors? And that sort of thing. So how are these learning variables used? They're used to help us do several things. First, they help us to select and develop the objectives for the instruction. In Chapter 6, we'll be talking about how we develop objectives from our goals and our sub-skills. Okay, so if we understand our learners, we can better develop our objectives. It influences the instructional strategy. The instructional strategy we'll talk about in Chapters 8 and 9 is where we decide how are we going to teach this? What kind of multimedia should we use? And we can take this learner information and make those better decisions. Helps the designer develop a motivational strategy. It can suggest examples. It can suggest ways in which the instruction should or should not be delivered. Okay? So think about learners and how knowing the learner could affect the training. If I know my learners are all, just making this up, over the age of 60 and have at least a master's degree and really like technology, I'm going to develop something much different than I would if I didn't have that information, perhaps. Okay? So then once we analyze our learners, we have to analyze the context. And we have two contexts to analyze, the first being the performance context. Okay, so we're As a designer, we're concerned about the characteristics of the setting in which the skills and knowledge will be used. Okay, we need to have an accurate analysis of this because we want to develop a more authentic learning experience. Because, and I know we've talked before about transfer of training and how important that is, that the learner actually transfer what they learned into their workplace. So one way we can do that is by understanding the workplace and trying to make the training as similar to that as we can. Okay, if we do that, there's more of a chance of us transferring that training. Okay, so what are we concerned about in the performance context? We're concerned about the managerial and supervisor support. I mean, think about if you go to training and you're really excited and want to come back and apply everything you learned, but your manager doesn't like the training or thinks the training isn't worth it and isn't going to support you doing that. Okay, so we should be very concerned with, that we have that element of support once the employee gets back to their job. We want to look at the physical aspects of the site. What are the physical aspects that could affect the performance, of the things we taught them? What are the social aspects, the relationships among coworkers, among subordinates, among their managers? And then the relevance of the skills to the workplace. If what we taught them is not relevant to the workplace, there may not be a transfer of training. So we want to be concerned with that too. Then lastly, we're concerned about the learning context. This is where we're actually going to do the training. Okay, so we're concerned about how compatible the site is, how like the site is to the performance context. Is it set up so that people can actually learn there? And we have different sorts of contexts. I mean, we would look at this differently if we had, a face-to-face where we're in a lecture hall versus an e-learning kind of context. Okay, so we would be concerned with these items. That's it for chapters 4 and 5. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you.